Great. Well, a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for coming along this afternoon to this event around Brexit and beyond. To say that the 2020s have been a bit of a roller coaster so far is I suppose something of an understatement. We've had a world dominated by COVID in the short term, helping people, businesses and places cope with the immediate challenges. In the medium term, trying to understand longer term implications and make sensible recovery plans. And then in the longer term, beginning to implement these recovery plans to try and make whatever the new normal might be as inclusive and sustainable as possible, and all the time trying to learn and adapt as we go. And on top of this, the COVID situation has also been a growing recognition in all sectors of the urgency of trying to ensure the socially just transition to a net zero world before it's too late. This is obviously going to upend and transform all aspects of societies and economies that serve them over the next 10 years and beyond. It's going to bring huge challenges, but it'll also bring plenty of opportunities. Both COVID and the net zero transition have highlighted and probably re-emphasized the important role of government and its agencies at all levels in responding to both the challenges and trying to realize the opportunities. But at the same time that all of this has been going on with COVID and with the transition, the consequences of Brexit have been unfolding on labour markets, trade, funding regimes, and et cetera. And in normal times, this might have had a higher profile, but as I've said, these are certainly not normal times. However, today's event does give us the chance to focus a bit more on Brexit and its consequences, what we've learned about its consequences so far, and particularly within a regional economic development context. So I'm really pleased that we've been joined today by two really well-known experts to help us think this through. David Bell from the University of Stirling, looking at things from the more from the UK context, and John Batchelor from Strathclyde University EPRC, looking at the lessons from elsewhere and the discussions so far about developing a new framework. And John, I know, is even his operations have been directly affected by the impact of Brexit. So they're both going to speak for 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to have time for questions and discussion at the end of that. I would like to encourage you to either put your questions in the chat box or to raise the hand function, because this then will allow me to see who's waiting and invite you to put your question or make your comment. So I think that's probably more than enough from me to get us going. So I think, David, I'll hand straight over to you, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks very much, Charlie. Great to be with EDAS again. It's been a little while. I'm now up in the very far north of Scotland, sharing my thoughts from there with you. So I'm going to get up a screen. So I'm going to talk about the UK context, and John's going to pick up on the more specifically Scottish issues. I've subtitled this Centralisation, Politicisation. That's, I think, I'm not going to explicitly talk about that, but those messages will come through in what I'm going to talk about. And so one of the key areas, I think, of interest, which has had consequences for economic development, is that what I describe as the post-Brexit political economy, which is largely about a radical change in the UK's political geography. And that has, perhaps as a consequence of Brexit or the Brexit referendum, resulted in major gains for the Conservative Party in the north of England. And as an aside almost, it seems to me that class has lost its political salience, and the Labour Party is struggling to come to terms with this fact. And until it finds some new way to interact with where its key areas that it controlled, it's going to remain in the wilderness. And for a set of different political reasons that I won't go into, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland weren't swept along by the same change. And I would also make the point that relations between the UK government and the devolved institutions are at a low ebb at the moment. Maybe we'll come back to that in discussion. A key point, though, is that the UK policy framework, the Conservative Party, is rapidly adjusting its policy framework to handle this new reality, it seems to me. And in respect of that, what I want to do is to focus specifically on that issue. How has the policy framework of the UK government changed to meet to adjust to the new economic geography, particularly in England? And what I want to focus on in terms of that changeover that's taking place are the Green Book, the Industrial Strategy, State Aid, the Internal Markets Act, and trade deals. And I'll have roughly about a slide on each of these that hopefully will kick up discussion later on. So the Green Book is a very important document held by the Treasury, which it uses to appraise options, investment options. And a number of commentators raised the argument that the way that investment, large-scale infrastructure investment in particular, was being directed, there seemed to be a considerable bias, I'll use that word advisedly, towards the southeast of England. And there was a review of the Green Book, and the Treasury acknowledged that its appraisal process failed to properly consider how proposals deliver on wider policy ambitions, and especially on place-based strategies, and what we now all have heard about, the so-called levelling up agenda. So the new book, the new version of the Green Book, under that, there will be clear cross-cutting objectives from the outset of policy development. So that, as we will see, probably is going to end up on very much on a focus on levelling up. A selection between options won't be based on the one that comes in with the best benefit cost ratio. There will be a threshold for the benefit cost ratio, and then it is unclear how decisions will be made between those which pass that test. In addition, the Green Book is going to place greater emphasis on place-based effects of policy, investment decisions. The industrial strategy, which was launched in as long ago as 2017, has now been abandoned. One might say it's not true that there isn't overlap between the two, the original 2017 industrial strategy and the new one, which is called Build Back Better Plan for Growth. There's still, for example, quite a considerable focus on productivity, but two key sentences contained in the preface to that document is that not all types of growth are equal. The focus of this government is to ensure the benefits of growth are spread to all corners of the UK. And the UK government's most important mission is to unite and level up the country. And so there are two parts in that I guess. One of it is a sort of unionist message that we keep all parts of the UK together, and the other is towards levelling up and thinking of that perhaps particularly in the context of the north of England. and redirecting more of the investment pie within England towards the north, a focus on place rather than, or more of an emphasis on place rather than simply selecting projects based on what appear to give the best benefit relative to cost. Okay, that's the industrial strategy. The Internal Markets Act is actually more about the relationship between the UK government and the devolved administrations. And it has, there are two kind of important aspects to this. One is around how the internal market within the UK will be regulated. Of course, that used to be an EU competence largely, but now that competence has been handled for Competition and Markets Authority. And we have introduced, or the Act introduced the principle of mutual recognition, which says that goods, I think, and services that satisfy the regulatory requirements of one part of the UK can be sold in any other parts of the UK, and well, it is seen by the devolved governments as limiting their powers to regulate where that regulation might affect markets where there is trade between the different parts of the UK, and that can cover masses of different areas in which government might wish to regulate. There are also measures enabling the UK government to provide financial support, and on this next slide I'll show you exactly what these are with a screenshot from the Act itself, which you perhaps can't read, but basically it says that a Minister of the Crown may provide financial assistance to any person or in connection with any of the following purposes, and the first purpose is promoting economic development in the United Kingdom or any area of the United Kingdom. So effectively, what this part of the Internal Markets Act is to allow the UK government to intervene to support economic development without necessarily in any way involving the Scottish government or indeed the Welsh government or the Northern Ireland Assembly in that activity. And it specifically includes a list of infrastructure areas such as water, railways, health, education, culture and sports, court and prisons, housing. So there are a wide range of areas of spending which perhaps the devolved government thought that were under their aegis, but through the Internal Markets Act, the UK government has developed, has given itself power to also intervene in these areas. And this, and John will touch on this, is the part of the Act that enables the Shared Prosperity Fund, the replacement for the structural funds, to be dished out by the UK government with possibly no reference to the Scottish government in that allocation. So that's an important, well, for economic development, that is of vital interest, it seems to me. I'll just finish off by briefly talking about trade deals, because they're not, they do not, well, trade deals and state aid. Trade deals do not seem like maybe they're all that relevant for economic development, but we're in the midst of the first of what it will perhaps be a number of negotiations with other countries around trade between UK and that other country, And these will have impacts on markets within the UK and consequences that follow for economic development. And the one that's been highlighted in the last few weeks has been the possibility of a deal with Australia. What free trade effectively would mean is that anyone negotiating with the UK would want to have that any competition across markets to be fair and free, and that would mean elimination of subsidy, which under the CAP, as far as agriculture is concerned, would be the basic payment system. And you can see from the numbers that I've got there for recent, just as an example, lamb prices are about 650 pence per kilogram deadweight in the UK, and the equivalent in Australia is about 500, and New Zealand about 340. So that they are massively competitive relative to UK production of sheep and lamb. So and that of course has created consternation in the farming sector in the UK. And these deals will have regional impacts, because when there is a negotiation about a particular sector, there's no sector that is evenly spread across the whole of the UK, indeed evenly spread across Scotland. So the Australian trade deal may well be particularly important both for Wales and for Scotland, which have above average representation in the sheep market. Finish off on state aid. The agreement that was made with the EU is known as the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, and that was what ensured free trade between the UK and the EU. And a key, you may remember that one of the key arguments towards well, there were two. One was fishing, and the other one was the so-called level playing field. And this is what is effectively subsidy control, the control of subsidies to particular industries or companies that are supplying goods which may compete with goods coming from the EU. And the UK has agreed to set up a subsidy control authority covering goods and services, and there will be a disputes procedure and remedies which will have to be negotiated between the UK and the EU. There are certain areas in which subsidies are allowed, like research and development, transport infrastructure, and regional aid. And what that allows the levelling up agenda to be effectively exempt from subsidy control. But we're going to end up in a hugely complex area when we think about subsidies, direct subsidies to companies. And for example, subsidies to agriculture are direct subsidies to companies. And on the one hand, we'll be dealing with the EU, which will continue to subsidize agriculture. And on the other hand, we'll be dealing with countries that are desperate to get into our food markets on the basis of no subsidies. So there will be a Gordian knot to get through as far as that is concerned. One important and final point is that, and I'm interested to think through what this might mean, for example, to the construction of the ferries going on in Greenock at the moment. There is no role for the devolved authorities in the regulation of state aid. It is the UK government which has taken on itself the powers to regulate state aid. So what I guess that means is that possibly if the Scottish government decides that it will put money into a company like BiFab, it will be the UK government that has the final say on that kind of intervention. That's what that's the sort of UK background to the specifics of some of the policies that have emerged, which I think are pretty much all consequences of Brexit and the political economy thereafter. And then I'll now hand over to John, who can talk more about the specifics in relation to Scotland. So I'll switch off my rather ineffective sharing. Sorry about that again.
No, thank you, David. That worked well. It was grand. I was just interested actually to see, just as an aside, that within that Internal Markets Act, the explicit recognition of social inclusion as being a component of economic development. So the fact they actually spell that out, yeah. That's very interesting. John, over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Charlie, and good afternoon, everyone. I feel that however interesting our presentations are, they can't compete with what's happening at the Science and Select Committee in London and what's being... Have
you got some really rockets for us to fire?
I don't think anybody's going to be referring to my presentation as a bombshell. Let me try and share the screen. Yeah, I'm John Bachtler from the European Policy Research Centre, which for the last 4 years is not just at the University of Strathclyde, but also at the Technical University of Delft, as a very much a direct consequence of Brexit. And I'd really like to pick up on where David left off and focus down more on the regional development challenges that we face and what the policy implications are, and really posing the question of whether we need to rethink the regional economic strategy for Scotland. Has the screen changed? Can I just check?
Yeah, that's fine.
Great, okay. Clearly, on top of sort of long-standing disparities and entrenched socioeconomic disadvantages, we now have the double whammy of Brexit and COVID. We've already seen estimates of the loss of economic activity estimated at something like 4 billion in 2019 alone for Scotland. And David has highlighted the differential impacts on trade but also in terms of investments that are still to play themselves out, because we really need to wait until post-COVID for a better understanding of what the implications are. But we can already see quite some major sectoral impacts. And then, of course, we've got the sort of the three sets of impacts of COVID. Firstly, the impact of the health crisis, and as Stiglitz and others have said, you know, the virus is not an equal opportunities pandemic. It's really affected some sectors, demographics, and others more than others. And then there's the impact of the containment measures, which have really hit some sectors very, very hard. Others have been able to weather the storm more through adjustments such as remote working. And then, of course, there's the way in which the recovery takes place in terms of its pace and scope and how that affects different parts of the country. And let's not forget that, you know, if we weren't talking about Brexit and we weren't talking about COVID, the big challenges that we would be facing are the twin transitions of climate change, and particularly the energy transition and digitalization. And both of those are having very differentiated effects on different parts of the labor market, the economy, and society. And then, of course, when we're interested in regional development, there's the regional policy context, which David has already touched on. And I think, crucially, regional imbalance, the whole issue of regional policy has got a higher profile at UK level than I think it's had since the late 1970s, very much under this phrase, levelling up policy, which is difficult to interpret and difficult to understand the degree to which it has conceptual basis. And it has variously defined but very ambitious goals. We've seen some of it in the Build Back Better document, but there was a white paper promised for later this year, being very much driven by Downing Street and the Cabinet Office. But the four goals that are highlighted are focusing on struggling towns, ensuring that every part of the UK has a globally competitive city, catalyzing centres of excellence, and strengthening the union, as David said. We can see a mix of I suppose, fairly standard responses in terms of the way UK government intervention has proceeded, in terms of local grants, investment in infrastructure, enhancement of the growth deals, and also a return of or resumption of an emphasis on relocating public employment, which was a huge and really important tool of regional policies back in the 1980s and 1970s. Sorry, the 1960s and 1970s. What's interesting is that there's a lot of use of the language of place-based policy, but essentially it's very much a top-down approach from the centre, which is something, again, that we haven't seen to this extent for quite some time. And crucially, there is a reshaping going on of the relationship between UK government and subnational government in terms of economic development, particularly as far as devolved administrations are concerned, but also other levels. So where does that leave thinking about regional development and policy in Scotland? Well, I think it's useful to perhaps talk a bit about the levelling up debate, if you like, that we had in a steering group as part of the 2-year consultation and discussions about how Scotland would anticipate implementing the successor to structural funds, the Shared Prosperity Fund, at a time or in a period when it was anticipated that responsibility would be devolved to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Now, while the SPF, which will come into place, will be introduced next year, this will be a UK government fund, and the Scottish element is unclear, but is probably not going to be significant. But looking at the discussions that we had in this process of developing the Scottish SPF, I think it provides some insights into the collective thinking of the steering group into what is important from a Scottish perspective in terms of regional policy. And the overriding focus was a recognition of the need to unambiguously reduce economic and social disparities within and between places in Scotland. But with 2 overriding horizontal themes, there being well-being and climate change, and ensuring decentralization as much as possible, that the decisions made as closely as possible to people, businesses, and communities, and using the existing delivery infrastructure of regional economic partnerships and the development agencies for the Highlands and Islands and the south of Scotland. Now, if we look at that in a bit more detail, I think we identified 3 or 4 principles for a post-Brexit regional policy in Scotland. And I think in terms of the policy purpose, there was I think widespread consensus across the group. Firstly, in terms of accountability, in terms of a policy that would be held to account for making progress in reducing local disparities in economic, social well-being. So accountability in terms of a measurable impact. Secondly, in terms of challenging the status quo, providing space for innovative interventions, and of course being complementary to COVID-19 action and not necessarily seen as a substitute, or not seen as a substitute for that. And then, as I said, we had these 2 horizontal themes of sustainable development and well-being. I think there was also a wide measure of agreement on the governance of any post-Brexit regional policy in terms of using existing partnership structures, using the virtue of structural funds, which were that you had a 7-year program, so predictability, and subsidiarity, this point about ensuring that it is decentralized. Now, there were two areas where I think it's fair to say the consensus was not the same. And that applied firstly to the geography of funding. And firstly, there was quite a lot of discussion about the degree to which there should be spatial targeting. But you can see from the second part of that quote that there was, while it was agreed that funding should be allocated according to regional and local disadvantage, it said will require transparent methodologies. In other words, there is a but there. Secondly, emphasis on the place-based approach, which I think runs through a lot of existing economic development strategizing and interventions in Scotland. And it was recognized that there's a need to focus on local development challenges. But then you have the second part of the sentence structured around sub-regions, but based on the needs of community and recognizing the role of local authorities. So, you can already feel some of the acknowledged tensions, which were, I don't think, fully resolved in the group. And lastly, flexibility in terms of taking an open approach to the geography of intervention. And again, quite a complex sentence there, which hints at, if you like, some questions about how this could be made to work in practice. And the last of the principles, I think, was the one that was most contested. Now, if you look at the Scottish Government document, it says that central to the approach is community empowerment, and that ties in very well with the thrust of Scottish Government policy and policies of partnerships and so on, that there should be community empowerment. But the question here again is how that should take place. And I think one of the most difficult aspects is how to involve communities and citizens directly in decisions. Do you do that by involving them as consultees, or do you effectively give communities more direct influence in terms of designing interventions? And last of all, of course, if you're involving communities, there's the question of local capacity building to facilitate community empowerment and involvement. And there, the reference to aligning with the value for money aspects, again, hints at, this is potentially a long-term costly exercise if we're serious about local capacity building. So what we can see overall is, I think, a fair measure of agreement about how a post-Brexit regional policy would look, but some interesting issues that I think are worth further reflection and discussion. Okay, in the last part of what I want to say, there's a question of what is it that we could perhaps learn from other European countries who share many of the same problems, and particularly from some of the Nordic countries, which are more similar in size, geography, and challenges as Scotland. And I think one of the interesting things of continuing to find ways of linking ourselves into European debates is because there's, over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, there's been a real ferment of activity in terms of reviewing, revising, reforming, thinking about responding to regional development challenges, giving meaning to a place-based policy response to local and regional development. And I think it's probably the most exciting time that I can recall to be involved in regional policy. And this was before COVID, let alone now in terms of the challenges beyond COVID. Now, I think if one compares Scotland to the Nordic countries, we can see a lot of commonalities in terms of the key principles that I've talked about, the emphasis on inclusive growth, on sustainability, on well-being, on partnership, and so on. Many of these are very much meat and drink also in the Nordic countries and elsewhere. But let me pick out a few elements, 3 elements, which are, I think, a bit distinct and where one could perhaps have more discussion. And I think the first of these is the political importance on tackling regional inequality. Now, that's not to say that this isn't important in the Scottish Government, in its programme for government, or in terms of the way in which inclusive growth is defined, but place and cohesion is very much subsumed, if you like, important part of, but subsumed within the wider inclusive growth agenda. Whereas I think in Nordic and other countries, what we see is the reverse, that the lens through which inclusive growth is often viewed is through the regional lens, in terms of regional inequality. And that's made very explicit in the policy approach and in public debate. In Norway, for example, every 4 years, the government is required to produce a white paper on regional policy prior to a new government coming into office. And essentially it holds up to public discussion and political discussion. These are the problems, this is the progress we've made, this is what needs to be done. And that and in terms of a policy approach, I think that's quite significant. And you see something very similar with the regional development decision making in Finland and in terms of Sweden. And I think it also then puts much more emphasis on accountability for tackling regional inequality. That's also reflected in a strong commitment to equity. And those involved, you've been involved in regional policy for a long time, regional development, know that there is this constant tension and trade-off or potential trade-off between efficiency and equity, between national economic growth and regional development. What's I think notable about particularly the Nordic countries, but it applies also in Germany, in France, in Italy, Poland, and others, is the emphasis on phraseology in constitutions or as a basis for policy that all citizens should have equal living conditions wherever they live or equal opportunities. And now that is far more unambiguous, it seems to me, than the equivalent commitments that we see in Scotland. The second, and flowing on from that, the second difference is the more explicit spatial targeting of invention. Again, being unambiguously clear, these are the areas that we think are disadvantaged in whatever way for sparsity of population, rural underdevelopment, problems with restructuring, urban deprivation. And what that does is it sends a political signal, a public signal, and it drives policy coherence between what is sometimes called the narrow regional policy in Nordic countries, which is the focus on business development, skills and innovation, and the broad regional policy and covering other policy areas which are also expected collectively to focus on those parts of the countries that are disadvantaged in whatever way. And the third of the elements that I draw attention to is the focus on local community development. Now, we often refer to community in phrase such as community planning partnerships that wouldn't really be understood in the same way in many other countries, because communities essentially mean going right down to the most local level. And you can see that in the table on the right, where in Nordic countries, you've got not just counties or regions, sub-regions, but also a large number of municipalities. And when governments are talking about the community development, this is the level at which they're talking about. And that does a number of things. Firstly, the level of analysis is much more fine-grained. And if you compare the analysis that's possible in Scotland or is undertaken in Scotland, for example, in the dashboards provided by the Scottish Centre for Inclusive Growth, which does some fantastic work and is a really, really valuable resource. You look at what, say, Nordregio, which provides a similar service for the Nordic countries, Nordic governments, you see a much more fine-grained understanding of where it is that there are problems, disadvantages and problems. And that's then translated, that followed through with measures for community development, localization of employment and services at the community level and investment in capacity building. Now, that doesn't mean to say that regional policy is all about community development. It's just that it's an important element in the wider approach to regional development. So I hope that's been useful in sort of highlighting a number of questions and issues about for a debate about whether and how we need to rethink our approach to regional development challenges in Scotland. Thanks very much.
John, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, David. now has given us a lot to reflect on and think about there, both in the UK context, but also thinking about how this plays out in development of regional policy and how what we might learn from elsewhere and how we might differ. I should apologise, actually, probably at this stage for the makeup of this panel. I think various people have policies for not appearing on panels that look like this, but we'll just make the best of it. Liz, our chair, was going to join us. That might have helped, but she hasn't been able to. So let's press on. Any questions? If you can use the chat or the hand function so I can see you, that would be good. If I don't have an immediate one, I will kick that off just to start. I'm actually interested. I think it relates to both of you really, but David, you drew attention to the fact that under the state aid rules that have been agreed, that regional aid will be exempted from those state aid rules. I guess what I'd be interested in both of your interpretation on is, to what extent will aid be judged as regional aid, or will it actually be constituted state aid, which therefore would fall under the control of this new subsidy control body? What thought's been given to that?
I should have added one rider, Charlie. Effectively, state aid that is intended to generally promote economic development in an area is okay, but state aid that is perceived to be aimed at capturing companies or sectors from other parts of the EU, or from anywhere in the EU, I guess, would come under the aegis, would be subject to challenge, and would then go to the whatever we finally end up with as the arbitration body. There's a line which is yet to be defined.
Right.
But if the aid is seen to be sufficient to distort EU markets, then the EU can legitimately raise a complaint, and then it goes to whatever the dispute resolution mechanism is. Of course, the important thing as far as the UK government is concerned is that it's not the European Court of Justice.
No. Yeah. What about distorting competition within the UK?
Well, that becomes the Competition and Markets Authority. Yes, a very good question. That's a good question. I'm trying to think. Would one of the other local authorities are? I should have emphasised a bit more. Local authorities will become much bigger players under the UK. The way that the UK is directing some of the new funds, the Community Renewal Fund, the Levelling Up Fund, and so on. So might we have a complaint raised by one local authority that particular support benefits another? Could they go to the CMA? That I'm not clear about.
Subsidising the building of ferries, maybe.
Well, yes, but I noticed in the FT today there's some discussion of a huge battery plant for Nissan, which will receive tens of millions of pounds of support, and is most likely to go to Sunderland.
Yeah.
Well, can that be contested under the Internal Markets Act? I'm not clear, I've got to say.
John, any reflections on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still quite a lot of lack of clarity on how the UK subsidy control regime is going to evolve. I mean, I think there are four issues. One of which is, what role does state aid play in economic development? And on the one hand, there are these. The UK was very clear in the negotiations that it wanted flexibility in order to be able to pick winners, to be able to subsidize firms, as David said, but also insofar as tax competition overlaps with subsidy control. the issue of having flexibility to compete through tax measures. The second issue is the internal competitive outbidding issue that you just mentioned, and ensuring that different parts of the country can't compete against each other. I think a third issue is the asymmetry between GB and Northern Ireland, with Northern Ireland still bound by the EU state aid regime and GB not. And of course, part of the concerns relating to the Northern Ireland Protocol are about the backwash effects that there could be from Northern Ireland firms that have GB relationships. And then, of course, the last one is the wider relationship between the UK and the EU, and the degree to which anti-competitive practices or perceived anti-competitive practices relative to the EU state aid regime leads to some sort of countervailing action.
Yeah, okay, that's great, thank you. Got a couple of questions coming in from people here. So one around the, assuming the Shared Prosperity Fund follows the Community Renewal Fund pattern, do you think there will be sufficient, and this will apply to the UK level, will there be sufficient understanding of the Scottish environment? I think related to that as well, from Corey saying, how important is it that some sort of assisted area map is retained, and how granular does that need to be, particularly reference what you were saying about Norway, John? Maybe you want to start off on that one?
Yeah, I would invert it, the question, in a sense. I think the starting point is, what is our regional policy? Let's call it that. What is our regional policy designed to do? And then, the assisted area map would flow from that. Now, if our focus is on essentially working via local authorities, that the local authorities is the lowest spatial level at which we're looking at intervening, then I think that's then you'd have a certain type of assisted area map.
Yeah.
If we were across Scotland to put more emphasis on local disadvantage, and look at how we could assist local disadvantage through a whole suite of instruments from at different levels, that would involve a different map. Now, you look at, for example, the social security concession system in Norway, which is very, very fine-grained, and ranges from sort of maximum concessions in the north and in other areas, right down to zero concessions in the Oslo region and other urban areas. But having it at a micro, doing the spatial mapping at a micro scale does allow you to be very, very focused. I think that links to Ian Marr's question about the Community Renewal Fund, which has been developed, I think, largely pragmatically, to identify priority local authorities with a relatively simple algorithm that is problematic in itself about in the lack of granularity, but also in terms of being discriminatory, for example, in rural areas such as the Highlands and Islands. I think what we're not clear about is how the Community Renewal Fund and how its Shared Prosperity Fund project support will actually be assessed, because so much of the building of capacity for the Community Renewal Fund and the Levelling Up Fund has just been undertaken in the last month or two, the last few months. I mean, been recruiting staff in order to undertake the assessments, and it's unclear to what extent a project in, just take South Lanarkshire is going to be competing with a project in Devon, for instance, or in the northwest of England, and how they're going to be judged. So I think there are a whole series of questions here, but I think the starting point is, what is it that we want our policy to do, and at what scale, at what spatial scales?
Right, David, try to bring you in. Maybe just we could sort of fold Pauline Hinchon's point into this as well. I mean, the Scottish Government has been using community benefit clauses quite a lot in its contracts. How much will that sort of thing be allowed to be used in terms of achieving outcomes from public procurement? I suppose that really ties in very closely with the work that's being done on community wealth building and the like. David, any thoughts on either that or the other question?
Yeah, well, I mean, it always seems to me I mean, if we're thinking about inequalities and maps, typically maps don't, unless they are very spatially granularly defined, they don't pick up significant differences in however you wish to measure prosperity or well-being or whatever. I mean, we do have a great deal of granularity with our index of multiple deprivation, but even that is contested in terms of its accuracy. And of course, you have to balance that level of understanding of the geography of disadvantage against the capacity of communities, political bodies like local authorities, or regional development groups to intervene in such a way as to reduce gaps, reduce inequality gaps, if that's in effect what you're trying to do. And I mean, I've got to say that this has been thought about a lot in Scotland in the course of what we've been doing in relation to the discussion of how the Shared Prosperity Fund might be designed, and it's because of that, as John has said in his presentation, we hit on the idea of having a prominent role for regional partnerships, but also bearing in mind the community level and how this all might could be possibly pieced together. Now, what we've got so far from the UK government doesn't appear to be as carefully thought through. As John says, the indices that have been dreamt up for things like the Community Renewal Fund are fairly crude and have shown a little imagination. I mean, I am still gobsmacked that Highland and the City of London are in the same category for the CRF, I think it is. And although there is lip service being paid certainly to the role of local authorities, it does seem that the UK government here, and indeed the implication of the Internal Market Act to some extent, is very much a top-down approach to the delivery of support to localities, and that may not end well. Let us see.
Right. So it sounds like there is potentially quite a bit of tension between the sort of top-down and bottom-up dimension to this. And we're up to 3 o'clock now. Well, maybe keep it running for another 5 minutes or so. Alison Cairns is point there about regional policy post-EU and this relationship between policies which maybe in the past have been focused up on trying to level up GDP levels, but now moving more towards a broader sort of well-being perspective. Reflections on that, John, and maybe David?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one because of the decisions taken by UK government, which in many respects is sort of back to the future in designing grants which whose form and implementation are run centrally. And I don't know of any other major country that doesn't try to implement its regional policy through some form of multi-level governance. Now, of course, we do have policies for regional and local development. It's got very well developed policy for regional and local development in Scotland, but there isn't a regional policy in the way that Nordic policymakers, or indeed policymakers from other parts of Europe, would understand it. I mean, in the Enterprise and Skills Review, in talking about the importance of cohesion and regional disparities, it has criteria such as ensuring issues of regional equity are taken into account in project appraisal and business planning and reviewed against regional and inclusive growth impacts, ensuring national products and services are tailored to regional conditions. So, you know, there is a regionalized development policy, but there isn't a regional policy as it would be understood continentally. And I think that's the fundamental question I'm opening up, which is actually just repeating your question, Alison, in a different way. The question is where is the space for that, and where is the funding for that? Given that, you know, we have on the one hand a very well developed regionalized development policy architecture, and on the other hand, the UK is coming in with a levelling up policy at UK level, you know, I think we really need to think through here, where is the policy space and opportunity?
Yes, and what's the danger of distortion and yeah, absolutely, and diversion. Yeah, David, any last?
Well, if I was going to pick up the regional GDP and well-being aspects of the question, I am in a way, one of the things that I think we ought to start getting away for, especially if we believe in things like inclusive growth, is focusing on averages, whether that be average income or average well-being. To be honest, you know, I've done a lot of work with Danny Blanchflower on well-being, and actually we know quite a lot about it. We know the factors which affect it, but they tend not to change all that much. It is not an indicator that is easily susceptible to change. You know, if I was going to be asked, you know, what would be a major way of improving well-being, it would be about improving people's access to the labour market, reducing unemployment, reducing underemployment, and so on. But the focus on averages suggests that, well, actually we value, you know, an improvement to someone who's already earning 100,000 a year as much as to someone who's earning 5,000 a year, if they have the same effect on the overall regional average.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's the best way to be thinking about things, and we actually don't see much enlightened thought around that particular issue, that actually, just as in a sense our social security policy is about helping the most disadvantaged, then you know, where does regional policy lie in that domain as well?
Yeah, no, good point. Actually, I'm reminded from what you were saying. I just read something the other day about someone quoting someone in a meeting in Newcastle saying, well, that might be your GDP, but it's certainly not my GDP.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Look, I think we're probably just about run out of time there. So, David, John, many thanks. Given us a huge amount to think about there. This is obviously a picture that is continuing to evolve. So we'll do our best as a membership organisation, try and keep our members as abreast of it as possible as it does evolve. But that's been a huge huge help. Thank you very much. And also thank Alison and Elaine for their organisation, for others involved in setting it up. Let me just do a quick advertisement. The next event we will be running is actually one of the courses with Graham Roy, Introduction to Development, Economic Development. It'll take place over 3 weeks from the 9th of June. And we'll have more events coming up as we roll out the new People, Places and Planet strategy, following sessions of the conference. And we're also going to be establishing a climate community of practice within next month as well. So there's a lot going on. Thanks again to all of you for joining us and taking part. Thanks again to John and David. Safe home. Okay. Bye for now.